The following program is a presentation of Winchester Academy.
Well, thank you so much. Am I mic'd up? Are we good? Am I coming through on the system? Okay, excellent. Well, so they ask you to write up a bio, and then you write it up, and then you have to stand there while somebody reads it. It's terrible. So I apologize for that. So I'm from the Forest Products Laboratory. I'm a U.S. Forest Service employee, and then all those other roles I do as a volunteer. So I've got my Forest Products Lab shirt on today, and I have, like she said, the intro there, I've worked at the Forest Products Laboratory in the Center for Wood Anatomy Research since I was a freshman in college. So I like to tell people I was basically grown from seed by the Forest Service to do what I do. I have a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, a PhD, all from UW Botany, where I'm also now an associate adjunct professor, which means when you read my CV, you can hear banjos in the distance because I'm as academically inbred as it's possible to be, right? I've done everything at the same institution. And normally that's frowned on, but the Center for Wood Anatomy Research is the best place in the world to do what I do for a living. So why would I go somewhere else when we also have a world-class botany department to get my education? So Forest Products Laboratory is our country's national research laboratory for wood. It's the only laboratory in the Forest Service that has a national purview. All the other research laboratories are regional in nature. The Northern Research Station, Rocky Mountain Research Station, etc. So we cover everything. And because we cover everything, and in my group in particular, we actually have basically an international mandate, because even going back to 1910 when the lab opened, we were importing timbers. And we weren't just focused on the southern area or the northern area of the country. We were focused on the entire country, which means we had to be cognizant of those imported tropical timbers. The first use of botanical forensics, the first time it was used in a major trial. Anybody know which trial? Just shout it out. The Lindbergh kidnapping. The expert witness in that trial was, I never get this right, my predecessor's predecessor, and direct lineage. So this whole idea of forensic botany actually started at the Forest Products Laboratory. And so that's Arthur Kaler on the right in the chair. Arthur Kaler is this guy who was this expert witness in the Lindbergh kidnapping, my great-great-grandfather, academically, I guess. And he's being strapped into an early prototype of what? A lie detector test, absolutely. So in my laboratory, and I promise we're not going to talk a lot about research at the outset, because research, for those of us who love it, it's really exciting, right? And sometimes you can speak passionately about it and get other people excited, and sometimes everybody just goes to sleep, right? And so for what I do, I frame it as kind of three basic areas. Botanical wood anatomy, so that's this idea of the structure and function of the tree in the context of its physiology, worrying about things that only botanists care about. I'm not going to talk about that stuff. Then there's biocentric wood science. And that's this idea, I'm at the Forest Products Laboratory, but I'm a botanist. That kind of doesn't make sense. We have chemists, we have engineers, we have people who are worried about plywood or glue or 2x4s. And then you get a tree nerd like me. And that's what my job is on the research side, is to help the chemists, the engineers, other people who are looking at wood as a material and understand its biological origin. When wood misbehaves, it's because the tree did something for tree reasons. And then because think about it, a tree is meant to be what? Upright, a living creature. They're generally round. What's the first stupid human trick we pull? We cut them down, turn them into rectangles, dry them out, and then complain that we don't like what happens. That's not what the tree was doing originally. That's this biocentric wood science. That's the idea of it. But the third area really is this forensic wood science, and more broadly, of course, forensic botany that we're going to talk about today, but we really only work on wood in my laboratory. So botanical wood anatomy, you can see there's a little video happening in the lower right-hand corner. That's a tiny, tiny quartz probe pushing on that blue thing, which is the pit membrane between two adjacent tracheids in a softwood. That's the little hole that water flows through. That whole structure is about 20 millionths of a meter tall that we're looking at. And we're using a little tiny load cell to measure the amount of force it takes to push that pit over and then all the way through the other side. Unbelievably cool for no reason at all, right? This is so cool and it's totally impractical, but it's fun to look at. And that's botanical wood anatomy at its finest, right? This biocentric wood science can be things as simple as looking at what's happening to the structure of wood as wood is charring, looking at dimensional change issues for flooring, which is actually a multi-billion-dollar issue, so it's not trivial, it matters to our economy. And then understanding material properties of wood at a variety of different levels. We'll actually look at electrical properties and how things change when they char. And I try to have something of some visual interest on each slide. It don't always succeed. Then forensic wood science, we've got a bunch of different things that we've been doing. And a lot of this is in the context of combating illegal logging globally. It doesn't have to be, though. So basically, we're at a point now in our country where there is so little forensic expertise in wood that it's almost a foregone conclusion that if wood ends up as evidence, it's coming to me in my laboratory. There's pretty much nobody left. The FBI can't do this stuff to save their lives, and most other institutions are not competent, it turns out. And that's not just me talking trash about people, it's actually a scientific study we did. So why explain research? I mean, one, all professors are all narcissists and self-involved. And so all we want to do is talk about our research, right? But the real reason is that if you want to be a forensic something, unless you specialize in human bits and human juices, you can't make a living as a forensic biologist, as a forensic botanist, as a forensic you can't do it because you have to have a day job. There just isn't enough botanical evidence collected to keep you busy. The other piece of it is forensic botany it's a big tent, and we're going to talk about that in just a couple of minutes. It's not just one thing. My thing is wood, which is the tiniest little piece of botany writ large. And so you're probably not going to be able to be an expert witness in more than one or maybe two areas because we just can only learn so much in a lifetime to that level where you could give testimony. And so research is my day job. It underlies, it informs, it makes possible my forensic work. If I weren't doing research, if I weren't good at this stuff, if I didn't stay sharp with these things, it wouldn't be possible to have the expertise to do this. So forensic botany is the application of basic and applied botanical science in the context of laws. And there are 4 flavors. Everybody thinks about criminal law, right? Of course. And so the problem is you can't expect to make a living doing this. If you know the show Dexter about the blood analysis guy that is a serial killer, unless you're going to somehow go run around and commit crimes that involve botanical evidence, you won't be able to keep yourself busy. Civil law is where the money is, right? I go out with my hand lens and I can look at a piece of wood just about anywhere and figure out whether or not that ash table in the store is actually ash or not. Well, you get enough instances of somebody fraudulently declaring something or misrepresenting it, you could look at all sorts of civil suits. I also just, as a part of my normal work in the Forest Service, I just helped solve what ended up being a well over $1 million civil settlement for one of these forest fires out west, where one party was claiming that things happened a certain way, and they had essentially falsified the evidence. And I was able to demonstrate that their story isn't true and that tree couldn't have existed because it was actually a piece of a different tree added in to make the tree seem tall enough to have taken down a power line. And by showing that was a very, I'm not allowed to talk about how much, but anyway, it was I got a very nice letter of commendation from an assistant or from a U.S. attorney. That's pretty high up. If you're a federal government person, that's a pretty big deal. Forensic-like inquiry, this is probably the most important one. A lot of us scientists do, even if we have forensic expertise, even if we do active casework, if we are not working just on human pieces, we tend to have most of our money coming from forensic-like inquiry, where we use the same science, the same equipment, the same knowledge, the same logical processes to look at things that just don't happen to be evidence, right? Like say a historical artifact. Or say we're trying to learn something about past climate. We're trying to reconstruct what happened from a pollen record. Well, the expertise necessary for that is also the expertise that you use when you're looking at trace analysis of pollen to determine whether or not somebody, maybe what time of year they were interred, things like that. And then this fourth one I'm really excited about because I'm the only person that I know of that talks about it, so it makes me feel smart. But that's the idea, because right, we talk about we're using science in the context of law, but what if we lived in a world where our lawmakers even were organized enough to have to have bicameral legislation happening, right? That's very to this moment. But imagine if we lived in a world where lawmakers would say, hey, what's the best available science before we go making a law? That's pretty exciting, and I argue that when that happens, that's forensic also. So, graphically, we have the foundational botanical sciences. That will empower us straight up to do casework. If you have enough botanical background in whatever your little niche area of botany is, you can go right into casework. Or you can go into applied forensic research. You can say, oh, I have this foundational knowledge. I'm aware of the need for some kind of forensic technique. And for it to be valid, we need to do research. You can't just leap forth and say, oh, I had this idea, now it exists, so you've got to do the work. And in theory, foundational botanical science could influence policy and legislation. And there's interplay. You do casework, and you find out, oh, yeah, it would really be helpful if I had a little machine that goes ping that would let me do this other thing. And so it inspires that research. Or sometimes you're doing the research and a case comes along and you're like, hey, I happen to have the perfect thing. I've been working on that. And then when we have sufficient lack of ability to do casework, that can get policy people's attention. Conversely, if budget comes with policy, that can fund the ability to do casework, fund the ability to do research. So all of these things are kind of intertwined. So starting with forensic botany and this idea of foundational botanical science, when we talk about biological forensics, usually we're talking about human beings. Human beings either did it and or had it done to them. What's the primary context? We don't talk about wolf on deer violence and go investigate it, right? That's called nature. But if a wolf kills a person, then we're going to look into that forensically. If a person kills a wolf, we might look into that, right? So it depends on what's happening. So when we're talking about other non-human animals, that's not botany. All the rest of biology historically is botany, and that's the sensu lato, or in the wide sense, which is plants, algae, fungi, bacteria, all that stuff. Back in the old days, it was either animal, vegetable, or mineral. And if it was an animal and it was alive, it was vegetable, which is old school botany. So if we get one of these little like who's related to whom, everything, we just cross off the animals, everything else is botany historically. So how do we talk about these things forensically? Bacteria, when we can actually, people are finding out now that for one, you can do some estimation of postmortem interval, the time since a body dies or a person dies, based on the relative composition and the relative distribution of different kinds of bacteria that are growing on them. Even more interestingly, I think, we're also finding out that, like, even with college kids, when they have roommates for a year, 6 months in, their microbiomes are attuned to each other's. So you can actually do some determining whether or not somebody lives in a place as long as they said they do, because if you live with somebody for a long period of time, you end up with, even just months, you end up with the same microbiome or substantially similar. Fungi can be trace evidence. They can be also involved in decomposition. Algae, very commonly looked at in drowning cases. Okay, quite important for that. Some other protists, less commonly used. Mosses, ferns, liverworts, seedless plants, all of these things can be how long were they growing on that skull, or that's been out in the environment. Various questions for time of deposition, also trace evidence. Most people, and this is something that I'm going to bring up again later on purpose, but one of the things that's brilliant about forensic botany is that the bad guys don't know how to mitigate against it. Because if you brush by a plant and you get pollen in your sweater, you can't tell you have pollen in your sweater. We can tell if we look for it, if somebody collects it, the evidence, but how are you going to get rid of that? You don't know, and you can't, because pollen's some of the nastiest, toughest, most impossible to destroy stuff on the face of the earth. It's amazing biological material. So, that's the genius of it. The flip side is we've got to get people to actually collect the evidence. So, and then seed plants, like the real plants that everybody talks about, the fancy plants with flowers and stuff, can be evidence in a lot of different ways. So, again, botany is this big tent. Nobody can be an expert in all these things. So just to show some pictures, I was telling people at dinner, I love taking photographs of fungi. So the fungi and the lichens are mine, the algal pick I stole. And then mosses. One of the things that's interesting about, so in this lower left picture here, we have the moss. And you got the little green guys that look like little tiny spruce trees, and then you got these weird stalks on top of them, right? That's the sporophyte. These are completely different generations in the plant. This tells us something about where the plant is in its life cycle, what's happening environmentally. There's information encoded in all this stuff if we know to worry about it. So ferns, also very interesting. They have a very specific way of reproducing, which shows up as trace evidence quite a bit. And then the higher plant, the so-called the seed plants, right? And we talk about the plant body and we break it up into the shoot and the root, right? The shoot is the above ground stuff, stems, branches, leaves, the apical meristems that are the little bundles of stem cells that give rise to everything else. And then reproductive organs and their products are typically above ground. Not everything, right? Peanuts, right, develop underground, but most fruits and seeds develop above ground. And in the roots below ground, also meristematic tissue. We talk about a secondary plant body, so we make a distinction between little squishy plants and great big woody plants. The little squishy plants have an entirely primary plant body, that's what a plant anatomist would say, and the secondary plant body is wood and bark. And we have basically the same layout. There's not fundamentally that much difference between a little squishy marigold and an oak tree when you look at what's going on there. But if you find a piece of wood, you know it's not coming from a little squishy plant. You can eliminate a bunch of that. So we can go back and forth with how we can think about this. So how does any of this end up as evidence? That's one of the questions that we have to ask. One of the really common ones is linking a person or an object to a location. I guarantee you've all had a burr from a burdock stuck on your pants or in your shoelaces enough to make you want to scream, right? That is a plant tricking you because you're this very arrogant biped walking around doing stuff, wearing clothes, all the ridiculous things that human beings do, tricking you into moving its seeds around because it can't get up and walk around. So it puts a bunch of seeds in a little package filled with these Velcro hooks, and it sticks on you, it sticks in some fur, and it breaks apart, or foolish you pick it apart, and as you pick it apart, you know what you're not paying attention to? the seeds that are falling all over the place as you open it up. Plants are smarter than we are. That's one of the rules. Also, if you drown, your heart is still pumping while you've got all this water in your lungs. Diatoms in that water will actually make their way into your bone marrow. So if you get drowned in body of water A and then dumped in body of water B, they can take water samples and figure that out based on what diatoms you accumulate in your bones. Or if you're already dead, but you're dumped in there, your lungs may fill with water, depending on how long you're in there, how they submerge you. But your heart wasn't beating, so you accumulate no diatoms. So we can tell the difference between whether you were dumped or whether you drowned on the basis of accumulating botanical evidence. We can do a lot establishing timing. If you go outside right now, nobody's surprised to see red and yellow leaves. That gives us some very clear information about what time of the year that we're in, right? If you went out, say, 6 weeks from now and found green leaves, that would be extra surprising because we shouldn't be finding those right now. So we can learn a lot about that. Also, starch accumulation. So when you have active photosynthesis, the leaf spends all day doing photosynthesis, and it can't move the sugar fast enough, so it starts to build up starch and build up starch. And then we think plants are resting at night. It's just second and third shift coming out. They are just constantly processing all that sugar and moving it elsewhere in the plant. They're very busy at night, all night long. And so if you had a leaf and somebody collected it and preserved it the right way, and if the argument was, well, yeah, I was at that park where the body was dumped, but I was there in the morning, and you think they were there in the evening, that starch concentration in that leaf fragment, even though the leaf would put it, a DNA test would put it to the same shrub, looking at this physiological information could be the timing issue. Does that kind of make sense? Obviously, we're not going to go into all the things that could happen. It's just to give you a broad sense of a lot of these. And then another one, anybody, so I love this stuff. I love what I do. And then part of it is, like I tell my students, because my students will just sit there, and, or they're on their phones. And I'm like, dudes, you gotta pay attention. You gotta play along because I already know this stuff. So if you're not having any fun, what are we doing, right? If you're not learning, and so I try to keep it. I'm trying to be fun about it, but not just for you guys, for me too, because I've said all this stuff before, right? And so, but I do love doing this. So, so what got me laughing was, you know how like if you've got that one sad little patch of grass where like something happened and you're trying to get it to grow grass again in your lawn, you will never ever grow a blade of grass there, right? But you can cut entire rolls of sod off rolling over the edge of your sidewalk because basically plants will do whatever you want them not to do, especially if it's sod, right? And so if you go out into the wherever and you decide, hey, let's dig a hole and bury a body, that little patch of dirt looks different for a long, long time. A long time. Because that first year, you dug it all over. Let's just ignore the soil science of it all, okay? That's a whole separate issue, right? With mixing different horizons and all that. Let's not even pretend. Let's say you are super anal retentive. You bring 7 different tarps. You dig down to the 3 inches of topsoil. You set that aside carefully here. You get to the next layer and you dig that and you set that here. And then you put it all back in the right order, which nobody does. But let's pretend you did all that so none of the soil looked disturbed. What kinds of plants are you going to find in that first year versus the second year versus the, right? Like if we're worried about, is there a body buried here? And then I say, well, which body are you worried about? And you're just, we're worried about the girl that went missing last summer. I say, well, there's a 3-year-old tree growing there, so we don't have to worry about that. That's not possible, right? We can make inferences based on what plants grow, what stage of life they're in, those kinds of questions. Also, when you dig a grave, you cut a lot of roots, and that leaves a signal that people can see. But somebody has to know to collect this evidence, and then they have to collect it and store it properly. If you take a bunch of wet, squishy stuff and shove it in a plastic bag, you would just end up with goo. And we can't do anything with that. So it has to be dealt with properly. So now we're taking a break to talk about a case. So this was from the Waukesha area. And this is, all of my stories are true stories that I'm going to tell you guys. So I'm just trying to think of this cracked me up because these guys were so excited. So the DEA, they raided a known drug dealer's house. And this is in an area in Waukesha where you can walk down the street smoking a joint and they won't even bug you for it because they don't have time to prosecute for anything that isn't major, right? So, I mean, they'll probably still ticket you and you'll get a misdemeanor, but you're not going to trial. So they raid a known drug dealer's house and they find a bag of evidence. So MDMA is ecstasy, right? It's like a club drug, and you can make this stuff in your kitchen. You don't need super high-end everything, and it's not nearly as nasty as cooking meth. They go into this guy's house, and he has each of the steps for the synthesis printed up separately on each kitchen cabinet with the stuff for the step underneath each one. Which is, I mean, if you're going to try and get it done, right? You're going to make a little workflow. It's a good way to do it. Be organized, right? So one of the things that you can synthesize MDMA from as a starting issue is sassafras oil. And you can buy sassafras roots online for making homemade root beer, which may or may not give you cancer. That's a separate issue. And so you can extract this oil and then go through a series of chemical changes and end up with MDMA. So they find a burlap bag that says sassafras on it and the receipts from the internet company where he ordered the sassafras roots. So they want to charge him with manufacture and distribution. They've got the synthesis steps that end in MDMA, so you know where you're starting. You ordered the sassafras. So they get this bag of evidence. And sassafras is a tree, right? Actually, it's going to come back to us in a murder case in a little while here. And sassafras is a tree. They bring this in and they say, we've got this guy dead to rights. There is literally nothing that could ruin this case as long as these roots are sassafras roots. And so they brought him in for identification. And I looked right away and I said, ooh, we got a problem. Because these aren't woody roots. These are squishy plant roots. It's not wood. So we went over to the university herbarium and talked to people there. It's not wood, it's smilax. Smilax is the scientific name. Sassafras is both the scientific name and the common name, kind of like boa constrictor or Tyrannosaurus rex. That's just how we know them. Sassafras and smilax are not the same thing. Smilax are like in the lily family or something, they're related to that. Smilax is also called sarsaparilla, which is also used to make homemade root beer. So this guy tried to buy the stuff that would have given him the precursors to synthesize the MDMA, but because it was the wrong stuff, there was no actual crime. Right? Which was heartbreaking for them. They did everything right. The only person that did anything wrong was the criminal. You can just hope he was testing it out on himself, right? Like whatever he was making, because it wasn't ecstasy. Okay, so we were talking about the plant body, and leaves and shoots and roots and flowers and this and timing of that. What about DNA, right? Everybody wants to talk about DNA identification of people. Well, DNA identification in plants, in some ways, is even better, because we, human beings, we have two genomes. We have a nuclear genome and we have a mitochondrial genome. So we have two different sets of DNA we can draw from depending on what we're trying to do. Plants have three because they have chloroplasts and they have their own genomes. So plants actually have three different sets of DNA we can work from. Now, ploidy, you guys might have heard the term diploid, haploid before. So when we're running around doing our normal stuff, we're diploid organisms. We have one set of chromosomes from mom, one from dad, and that's what gets the job done. In plants, it's really, really common that the normal number, instead of being 2n, one from mom, one from dad, might be hexaploid instead of diploid. So 3 from mom, 3 from dad. So now, when we're trying to do a DNA typing study, we say, we want to look at this particular address in the DNA and see what kind of DNA did you get from mom and what kind did you get from dad. We talk about those different patterns as being alleles. And then we have this huge database and we say, okay, so for this particular address or locus in the genome, you can only have 2 different alleles, one from mom, one from dad. They could both be the exact same kind. They could be completely different. But in the total population of all the people, there might be 1,000 different genetic variations. And if we measure thousands and thousands of people, we know how abundant each variation is. We know its frequency. So we can say, oh, well, 10% of all people have that allele at that location. And 20% of all people have that allele at that location. So we multiply that together, 10% times 20%. We say, oh, there's only a 2% chance that at that location you would have those copies. It gets really weird when it's easy to say 1 from mom, 1 from dad. It gets really weird when we say 3 from mom, 3 from dad. We've got 6 of these things to worry about. So plants can be very, very complicated when it comes to DNA identification. And then the fun thing now is inside, even in a diploid plant, not all plant parts are diploid. And so if you had a botany class, we have this thing called double fertilization. And what happens is you get the little baby plant, which is the zygote, that's going to turn into the little, like if you ever crack open a peanut, you know, there's that little tiny thing in between the 2 peanut halves. That's a little baby plant. If you look at it carefully, you can see little leaves, you can see little root. It's all right there, cooked up and dead. The peanut butter is genocide. So, but we actually have, and let me go back, this where it says endosperm nucleus 3N. That's this thing where it takes maternal tissue and combines it with one of the nuclei that was in the pollen. And now you, instead of having, so you have a diploid baby, just like a human baby would be. You have diploid maternal tissue, just like a human person would be. And then you have triploid, 2 parts mom, 1 part dad, but not the part of dad that became the baby. Different genetic structure. So really, really cool. So just exactly which part of the seed you're doing a DNA test on, you'll get completely weird results. So that's good, clean fun. Now, just going to pivot and talk a little bit about this policy and legislation stuff. So in the, again, like it says, regrettably rare, when science does influence policy, and law specifically, my argument is that's inherently forensic. I'm happy at the end to entertain counter-arguments. I'm not a lawyer. This is a self-serving argument, but it works really well with the students to get them kind of jazzed up about why we should care about science. Why should we care about STEM? What is the relevance of this stuff if you're not going to go make a scientific doohickey or solve a problem, or what if we had scientific literacy such that people just took for granted that we should be informed by it when we make decisions? Blow my mind if that would happen. But so I have had the good fortune, though, to have this happen in my career, because in 2008 we passed this Lacey Act amendment. And the Lacey Act goes back to the late 1800s, and it was basically this, and this is a very low-level summary and not necessarily entirely historically accurate. But basically what happened was we had people going out into the West while the West was still territories and poaching. And if they could get their poached mountain lion out of Wyoming and into Manhattan and the taxidermist, it was only illegal until they got their skinny little behind out of Wyoming. And so there was this senator, Lacey, who said, no. If you harvest wildlife in contravention of local law, it is illegal across the country. And that was the original Lacey Act, was a Wildlife Protection Act to say that. To say if you go shoot antelope on the Great Plains, you can't put them up legally just because you got away from the scene of the crime. We extended that to fish in the 40s or the 50s, for salmon and things like that. And then I want to say in the 70s, but I'm totally not sure, we extended that to animals from other countries. Congress is not going to pass a law that says it is illegal to harvest a rhino in wherever they live, right? I almost said grow because I'm a botanist. Wherever they live. And because we're not going to pass that for every species. So this just says, if Zimbabwe says, you can't kill that, then if you try to bring it here, it's illegal. That's what the Lacey Act does for us. In 2008, it was extended to plants and plant products. And it was called, and of course it's a law passed in 2008, so what was it called? The Combat Illegal Logging Act of 2007, because it takes at least a year to get anything through Congress. But that's the Lacey Act Amendment. And so for wood, which is my specialty, the Lacey Act, one of the things that's great about it is it has a requirement for affirmative declaration that you can be held legally liable for. You have to declare the botanical species, genus and specific epithet, scientific name correctly. You have to declare where it came from. Not, oh, I got it from a warehouse in Shanghai. No, where did you cut it down? Where did it grow? And then how much? Obviously, some of these things can be tested. Like, we can figure out how much by measuring it. That's pretty straightforward. That's not exactly a mystery. Figuring out the species might be a completely more difficult, or the geographic origin may be impossible task. So provenance or origin and quantity are the two number one. That's brilliant. You can tell it's evening time for me. I've been up since like 4. The more common issue, or rather sources of illegality are we're lying about how much we brought in, or we're lying about where we got it. Those aren't necessarily always testable. We can do more with species. So then these are questions that, and this isn't, again, I am an academic, so you could just say, oh, I'm making an academic argument. This is a legitimate argument. We're going to get to why in a minute. What is a species? How do we define species? Once upon a time, if you talk biology class, there's the biological species concept, right? This idea that you have, if two individuals are of the same species, if they can mate with each other and have fertile offspring that are back fertile to the parent generation, right? Hopefully not the same parents, but at least that generation. So it's about breeding. So of all the different species we talk about in the world, animal, plant, what have you, how many do you think we've done this experiment for? Not most trees, because they might be 60 years before they're sexually mature. Take a long time. That's a multi-generational study to figure out whether or not these two species of tree are the same species or not. We actually don't use that. It's a nice way to think about it. And then here's another one. Let's just say, for argument's sake, a zillion years ago, some acorns from an original population, some of them ended up over here, some of them ended up over here. Glacier melted, there's a river between them, and now there's no gene flow between them anymore. This one looks completely different. This one looks completely different. We call them different species because they look different, but they're nowhere near each other, so we're never testing whether or not they're interfertile. That's what's allopatric species. They're in completely different areas. Or what if you have two things that you think are different species in the same area, and the way they keep their pollen apart from each other is that one flowers in the spring and one flowers in the fall. That may be because they're different species. It may be because it's one species with different strategies. Why worry about this stuff? Well, first off, the type species concept is what we actually use. Somebody who is a self-declared expert, for good or for ill, goes out and says, hey, that's a new species of tree I've never seen before. I'm going to write a Latin description of the flowers, the fruits, the leaves, collect specimens, put them in a herbarium, and then say, there it is. And that type specimen, that individual tree, is the Platonic ideal for the definition of the entire species. That is how we actually do biology. And then there are evolutionary arguments too in saying, well, let's get the DNA and look at it and call a species whatever is the most appropriate group of everybody who's most closely related to each other. Why does all this matter? Why care about this stuff? Species are referred to in the law. We have an Endangered Species Act. It's like if you've heard about like fentanyls in the news, right, with overdoses, and they talk about how with synthetic drugs, we can't update the definition of what's legal as fast as people can, put little tweaks on formulae, right? And now all of a sudden you have something that's even nastier and it's not illegal because of a tiny little change. Same thing happens here. If you have an endangered species of whatever, ferret, I don't know anything about ferrets, but let's say we've got an endangered species of ferret, and then somebody comes along and studies it and says, actually, this isn't a distinct species. This is just a weird population of this larger species. Well, poof, now, by definition, it's no longer endangered. Or you have to extend the endangered blanket over all of these other ferrets you didn't think were endangered before. This stuff really does matter. So species can be protected. Species can be illegal. Now, cannabis, marijuana, not a species question. That's a cultivar question or a variety question. That's a chemical content question, not a species level question. So how we define them, how we actually publish them in the scientific literature, as boring as that is critical to how this work goes forward. So this is kind of the glorified high level, who's related to whom and to what degree, family tree for all plants. So starting with the earliest seed plants up at the top, and then moving down to the most distantly evolved that are still alive today. Of course, right, there's a bunch of extinct stuff that never shows up. So now a little bit on casework. So this is actually, so I've given, whatever, I'm a professor, so I give lots and lots of lectures at the university, and I've given a bunch of talks, and I don't know how many times, and I've gone to lots of conferences, and I write up research projects, and slide after slide after slide. The normal title I use for this is the wood anatomy and identification of sauerkraut. So I grew up outside of Milwaukee, so you can still hear it in the voice every once in a while. I slip, or if I get going a little more casual, and then, don't you know it? And so I, like with my students, I do a whole thing making fun of the Milwaukee accent with this, because obviously, so the world's largest sauerkraut manufacturer is where? In Wisconsin, it is. That's correct.
Bear Creek.
Wisconsin's as close as I was trying to get. Was we found? Sorry, my bad. No, yeah, no. It's just that they're located in Wisconsin, and so let's see here. So did you hear it? There it was. Yeah. So basically they ship out the seasoned sauerkraut, and people start breaking their teeth on pieces of wood in sauerkraut. Now, pieces of wood showing up in food products happens more often than you might think. I am going to give you a teaser and then not tell you the actual answer because there's liability issues. But there are of the several major chocolate companies in North America, there is one of them that regularly gets wood in their products, and I find out because it's part of a civil lawsuit because somebody choked or died or had their vocal cords slit when they coughed a piece of wood through, and they're a professional singer. Then there's another company that their QA/QC team finds a tiny little piece of wood on some screen and freaks out and dumps an entire batch of chocolate, shuts down the entire system, and until we figure out where that came from and how it happened. Very different answers to what are fundamentally the same problem. So wood ends up back in the old days before we had all this automated stuff for pills and stuff, we actually had a pill company send us a piece of wood exactly shaped like one of these pills that showed up in one of their bottles. It had just rubbed away and finished and made its way through one of the filters and the slots, and now it'd be almost impossible for that to happen nowadays because they have inline spectroscopy and things like that, but it would obviously be flagged as non-chemical, not the right chemistry. But so this stuff does happen, and so they sent me the pieces of wood sent by the customers and said, hey, I was eating a brat, I broke my tooth, and at least Milwaukee people, it's not like it's LA. Milwaukee people are I figured you should probably know. Not like I'm going to sue you. I thought you should know. And then the company's well, here's a couple of coupons for some free sauerkraut. And now everybody feels like they've made out, right? It's I let them know there was a safety problem, and it's all good. And so the customer's saying wood, the company's saying it can't be, it has to be cabbage. And so they shipped this stuff to me, and so with a little tiny specimen, I cut it with a razor blade, I look with my hand lens, and I figure out when I need to make a microscope slide. And I've been at this, I mean, at this time I was only at it, I don't know, this was a while ago, but still done thousands and thousands of identifications at this point. So it's like if you're walking around the woods and a bird lands on the branch next to you, it's either a bird you know or it's a bird you've never seen before. You don't need a field manual and a book to figure out whether or not you recognize the bird. You either know it or you don't. And sometimes you know, oh, I've seen that and I don't remember what it is. And sometimes you go, I have no idea what the hell that is, right? Never seen that bird before. So that's what happened with this. It's the same process. It's just with cells under the microscope or with a hand lens. Cut this and I look and I go, well, that's wood, but it is absolutely not a piece of wood I've ever seen before. So at the very beginning of the talk, I said I'm from the Forest Products Laboratory. We have this nationwide thing. One of the things that makes us the best place in the world to do what I do is that we have the world's highest quality, scientifically collected reference collection of wood specimens from all around the world. We have over 105,000 specimens of thousands and thousands of species from everywhere in the world. So I was like, okay, could it be cabbage? Cabbage doesn't make wood the way we normally think of it, but I'm a botanist and I have kind of a different definition for how we look at this stuff. So I thought, well, this is definitely a wood I've never seen. The first assertion is that it's from a cabbage plant, so I'm going to check the wood collection just in case we have a wood specimen from cabbage. Because, well, it turns out we did. We have one specimen of wood from cabbage. And I cut it, and I looked with my lens, and I'm like, oh, that's what this is. I made a slide of the specimen from the collection, made a slide of the specimen from the evidence. Everything matched up. And so the answer is yes. Is it wood? Yes. Is it cabbage? Yes. The base of a sunflower plant made out of wood. Anybody have jalapeno peppers dying off in their garden right now? If you look at those plants, the bottom 6-8 inches has bark. It's green and shiny and squishy plant on top, but it's converted over to wood and bark on the bottom. That is entirely made out of wood. I've got a bunch of jalapeno pepper plants with 6-8 inches of pure woody stem at the bottom. Marijuana plants at the bottom, wood. Wood is much more common. Carrots are made out of wood. So when you eat a carrot, you are eating wood. So if you're the botanist and you want to know what happens when you have a vascular bundle, which is how stuff moves around in the squishy plants, you have water moving in one tissue called xylem, you have photosynthate or sugar moving in the phloem, and when you want to go from being a little green squishy plant to being a woody plant, you have to transition, right? Because obviously, all the great big oak trees started as little things you could scrub between your finger and thumb and turn into paste and fling away. They all start tiny like that. So what happens is the cells between the xylem and the phloem in the cambium in the vascular bundle start to form what's called a cambium, which is the layer of stem cells that will eventually produce wood to the inside and inner bark to the outside. And so what happens is instead of that forming up and making a sheet all the way around and turning into a tree trunk, it just makes wedges. So the backstory for this was the sauerkraut company had been growing normal cabbages, right? Volleyball-sized cabbages. Then they got access to a new cultivar that made beach ball-sized cabbages. And they grew the new beach ball-sized cabbages, and they didn't change how the coring machine would cut that core out of the cabbage. Because you know if you try to chew through that core, it's a totally different experience because it's wood. That's why it's a different experience, because that's wood in there. And so now this is back, I'm jaded and awful now, but back then I was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and so helpful. So idiot me, I told them, because this was the middle of the growing season, I said, well, send me some of these gigantic cabbages and I'll map out the wood for you and you can change your coring machine. So they did. It was late July when they sent me some ones that were getting close enough to full size, and they sent them to me, and they arrived on a Friday afternoon. And I didn't get in till Monday morning, and they sat in my 80-degree office all night. I have the paperwork still in a sealed plastic thing because it still smells like rotting cabbage. So ultimately, I ended up mapping this stuff out, sending it back to them at great personal risk because of the stench. But they did what companies often do, which is they punted and reverted back to what they're comfortable with, right? What they know succeeds, and just go the safer route. So that was a civil case. Okay. This story doesn't make sense because people that murder people usually aren't, the interesting murders at least, they're not thinking properly. So the story doesn't make sense. So this guy, who was, I want to say he was 50 at the time, decided for whatever reason that what he needed to do was murder his 16-year-old son's girlfriend's mom. So he does. She goes missing. This is in 2010. And as is often the case, everybody knew it was him. They just couldn't prove it. So this woman goes missing without a trace in 2010. In 2018, Roger Carroll, our charming fellow in question, decides he's going to kill his wife. And so he's beating her, he's tasering her, he's trying to lock her in the closet, and she gets away and calls the police. Now, in the meantime, back in 2010, when he decides to murder this other woman, his 16-year-old son sees him do it. So he makes his son help with the body disposal. Dad had already built a brush pile to burn up this woman's body. So this was very much premeditated. He lured her to the property. He had already built a disposal area. Well, brush piles, everybody's burned them. They burn really hot, but not for very long. Not enough to get rid of a person. They had to go back for days. And he made his son participate in this, burning her up until they could scrape what was left into the bucket of the tractor and drive over and dump it in the river. So it's 2018 when Dad flips out and tries to kill Mom, and the kid comes forward and gives grand jury testimony for immunity on what happened in 2010. So they moved her body, Bonnie Woodward, to this brush pile, burned the body. So where's the wood anatomy, right? Where's the wood anatomy of a missing person? You see that tree? See the bottom of that tree has a wound? That's the evidence in this crime. They were out there doing a body recovery. It's like a high-speed archaeological dig. You dig up the soil and you're looking for bullets and you're looking for whatever. I helped teach this for Wisconsin in 2017 with the Wisconsin State Crime Lab and Dane County Sheriff's Department for our people. So they're going through all this. They don't find anything useful. And then one of the investigators, and this happens to be about 45 minutes northeast of St. Louis in Illinois. So on the Illinois side. And so one of them says, well, this is gross. They burned this lady. And this is where it gets really gross, but a human body, when you burn it, fat will melt and drip, and you have all sorts of juices soaking into the ground. So he goes, well, maybe this tree soaked up people juice, and we'll be able to detect that. So they called the Missouri Botanical Garden. The Missouri Botanical Garden's like, well, yeah, people juice isn't really a thing, but they explained this wound, and they said you should send that up to the Forest Products Lab. So I told you sassafras was going to come back around. The investigator said, oh, we've got this oak tree. It's not an oak tree, but so I have these rules with my students. I have a bunch of them, but one of them is a pair of rules, which is always get it in writing. Don't ever put anything in writing. Those two go together, right? And this was a case where I don't know on the legal side whether or not there's an expectation that this investigator can tell the difference between an oak and a sassafras tree. So I don't want to put anything in a report that makes him look stupid for something that I think in common sense you'd say, he knows about police procedure, not botanical identification. You shouldn't expect him to be an expert in this area. So I called him up rather than sending an email and said, hey, you have no idea what you're talking about botanically here. Does that matter? He says, it doesn't matter at all. I said, okay, we don't want this whole case to collapse. With the sarsaparilla sassafras, it collapsed because it wasn't the right thing. We don't want this to collapse because of some kind of small mistake that we could make. So the fact that it's sassafras actually doesn't matter. What matters is we only have the son's story, And the son gave the story only after mom was threatened. It had been 8 years of him knowing exactly what happened to his girlfriend's mom and not talking. So it's not a great look, right? I mean, not his finest moment, maybe. And so they cut down the tree for me. I told them, they sent me cores first, and I couldn't do a squat with that. And I said, well, what I really need is I need like the whole thing, because I need to be able to figure out the growth rings and do like a dendrochronology thing and say, okay, we know the tree was alive in 2018 when they cut it down. They cut it down at the end of June, which happens to be 8 years after she went missing, was the end of June, so it's even the same time of year. So let's see what we can do. So what we're going to go for here is, those of you who saw us having our AV struggles, this is what it was all about to get this video to play. We're going to, this is a magnified image with our xylitron system, and we're going to reference against that little pink tag on the right for what we're looking at, and we're starting with the outer bark. So let's hope for the best for the audio here.
So the alleged fire happened in June of 2010, and this tree was cut down. It was alive at the time it was felled in June of 2018. So if we start at the outside, this is the outer bark. We move inward to the inner bark, and then this is the partial growth ring that was being formed when the tree was cut down in 2018. So this is 2017, 2016, 2015, 2014, 2013, 2012, 2011, and then 2010. Now we move laterally in the 2010 growth ring toward the site of the wound to see whether or not the wound lines up with having occurred during the 2010 growing season. And here we get to the margin of the wound. And you can see quite clearly that part of the growth ring of 2010 was formed. Then we have this wound. We continue over here. You can see some of the growth ring in the uninjured part was still formed afterwards, so it's consistent with the middle of the growth ring wound. And then this is wound healing tissue up here. And this process that I just did, showing you this with the xylitron, which I'll tip the camera here, is exactly what I did in the courtroom. And actually, they let me keep the piece. So this was People's Exhibit 130. That was part of this case, and it came back to the laboratory with me.
So that's, I literally took this equipment, which is this imaging device and a laptop, and I had that piece of that cookie of tree in my lap, and I had a TV like next to me like this, and then the jury was right there. And so a couple funny things. One, I don't get, I wasn't even the tiniest bit nervous waiting to talk to you. I don't get nervous public speaking. I was terrified to get on the stand. And I don't know why, because I know all the stuff, but I'd never done it before, and I was fidgety and nervous and spazzy, and it was like I was over answering. Those of you who might not be surprised, and they're like, Dr. Wiedenhoff, can you please just dial it back to the yes no, and I'm like, yeah, that's no fun. But so of all the things that I've done though, one of the single hardest feats is to be up on the stand and count backwards from 2018 to 2010 and your first take without screwing it up. I was mortified. I was just like, just get. Then you start thinking, don't skip one, don't skip which one am I on? It took me 4 takes to shoot this video, but I nailed it when I was in court. So, so that's an example of some forensic botany that I did, at least for a criminal case. And then this forensic-like inquiry in science, I just want to show you a couple things, and then we'll be ready to take questions. So historical reconstruction, if we want to understand something about an anthropological site, tools are made out of, on the biological side, are made out of things like bone, shell, wood, right? And then clothing, typically botanical or animal materials, if it's skins or fur or then some kind of fiber. Garbage pits will have food. We can learn a lot about an anthropological site by understanding what kind of food was being disposed of, what kinds of things they were burning for fire. Did we have botanical materials involved in the construction? And archaeological sites can be similar, foods, flora, timing of deposition, but also we can learn a lot by doing a forensic-like analysis of an archaeological site and saying, oh, yeah, we know this is Roman or whatever, but why are there nickels in here? Well, no, nickels would be a bad example, whatever, pence pieces or something, right? And it's because, a pack rat midden was through there and then brought in things that are anachronistic timing-wise. We can learn stuff like that using the same, like I said before, the same science, the same techniques, the same equipment, the same rigor to get to these places. And so these are some examples of some artifacts where a much younger me was doing this in cooperation with my colleague from Oxford in the UK, Joanna Estepkovich, who's the world expert on the wooden cultural patrimony of the Taino people. Taino people were the indigenous people of the Caribbean that Christopher Columbus met, the so-called Indians. And so some of the only things we really know culturally about those people as a people come from what's left of their material culture, including wood. So I would like to stop there and entertain any questions.
Just want to thank you, Alex. That was great. Raise your hand if you have a question.
Was this on?
It's on.
Okay. I just need to say that I first made contact with Dr. Wiedenhoff 6 years ago about I heard him speak on WPR on the radio, and it was such an interesting program. And we made contact, but with changes of email addresses, movements, of COVID, and all of those things, it just didn't come together until this year, and we're just honored to have you here. So, any of you with questions, raise your hands, please.
You mentioned some affiliation with Brazil. What did you do there?
Yeah, I'm in. It's professor estrangeiro. It's like
Of course, you're a foreigner, no doubt.
Yeah, it's like adjunct professor. So the wood anatomy as a discipline is very much on the wane in the United States. It's largely dead. I mean, there's the guy that works down the hall from me. There's me. There are a couple other people that are retired, and that's about it for people who are doing much with kind of traditional classical wood anatomy. In Brazil, up until the economic collapse in 2015 and then the Bolsonaro era, they were adding a university every week across the country, and they were specifically hiring and training wood anatomists because wood is a part of their national economy. So wood anatomy was booming in Brazil, booming in China, and dying in lots of the rest of the world. And so my mentor had really good contacts with the best people in Brazil, and I love foreign languages. And so I will take any excuse. I started learning Ukrainian when the Russians invaded just for something to do, and I stopped after a couple weeks, but I'm like that. So when I knew I was going to Brazil, I started learning Portuguese, and I already spoke Spanish sort of, and so and then I got down there and I was starting teaching classes, and so yeah, I have good colleagues down there, good friends, and good affiliations with the group. Yeah.
Can I ask you a little?
Absolutely not.
The wood that grows over there in the coastal area of the Pacific, called it's a scraggly-looking tree. Supposedly is there and in the Holy Land. Do you know which one I mean? Is it true that they're I'm sorry, senior brain won't bring it to me. They make trinkets out of it and sometimes beautiful bowls, but it's a scraggly tree that grows in the Pacific area right against the ocean.
So this kind of gets to why do we talk about species?
Uh-huh.
And that would be extremely unlikely to be the same species.
As the one that is in the Holy Land.
Right, but it could be in the same genus, right? So we have species of oak that grow here in North America. There are completely different species of oak that grow in Europe, but they're still oaks. Yeah.
Thank you.
So you, early in the talk, mentioned that it would be hard to be full-time employed as a forensic scientist in botany or anything. My recollection is that the original CSI program, the guy was an entomologist. So is that something that may be more or whatever. I mean, he probably just did more analysis than just bugs, but
Well, I mean, forensic entomology is useful for estimation of post-mortem interval, right? So it's actually kind of interesting. If you die indoors and you're there for, let's say, 12 to 24 hours, and then you're taken outdoors, different bugs are growing inside you than if you died outdoors and remained outdoors, died outdoors, and were brought indoors. Different bugs are growing in different part of you if you were face down for a while and then right side up, depending on how long. All of these things are out there. And then there's, and I want to say I can't remember, it's Texas or Tennessee or maybe both have body farms where they look at this kind of stuff and say, okay, we're going to take human cadavers and put them out there, and how long, and then looking at seasonality, right? What sorts of, the second instar of this species, but it's the fall, so the outdoor temperature is 35 degrees instead of 78 degrees. And so there's a lot more forensic entomology that could happen just in terms of human bodies. And then we also see things in somewhat related contexts like emerald ash borer, right? That was a phytosanitary problem where we didn't clean up some stuff coming in, and it brought us this nasty bug that is now killing off all our stuff. If we had had people with the right expertise doing the right kinds of investigations, would it have been forensic? But forensic-like, right? With the same kinds of science, the same kinds of things coming to bear. So yeah, a forensic entomologist can be a lot more employed. I have a colleague down at Arizona State, and I give a talk in her class pretty regularly. And yeah, I think the nation could support a handful more forensic entomologists for sure.
So in Wisconsin, if you were in the building trades, what woods would be restricted in terms of usage? We always heard things like the black walnut trees are restricted or are endangered and can't be used. Is there a list that you know of, and is that list growing or getting smaller?
So for Wisconsin trees, I guess I'm not current on whatever's going on just in Wisconsin. There are internationally endangered species that are listed that are just flat out prohibited, and those are listed by CITES, the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species. Then there are certain countries that have export bans of certain timbers, and then because of the Lacey Act, that makes them illegal here across the entire country. So there are lists, they are growing. So to answer those questions directly, with regard to Wisconsin specifically, I'm not that aware. The biggest problem in North America when it comes to illegal logging, we don't have that much of an issue of the major parts of our supply chain for domestic production with being illegally sourced. We have more of a problem with imports having been produced illegally, or with individual cases of timber theft. Somebody snuck into a national park, snuck onto my land, whatever, cut down 50 trees, those kinds of issues, but not so much with the main supply having illegality problems. Largely because we don't have that many interesting species compared to the rest of the world. I mean, wood here is boring compared to the tropics, trust me. So, and actually, and related to that, and I know some people are going to want to go, I'm going to set up my, during COVID, when we were in lockdown, I basically taught myself 3D design and electronics and stuff, and that Xylotron thing that I was using to image the cookie from the murder tree, I developed a smartphone version. And so I can stream the output of this onto this laptop, which I can hook to that HDMI, which means everybody can see. And then you could also play with it, because all you have to do to look at something is then put it flat on there, and it shows it. So it's kind of neat. The world is unbelievably beautiful at like 15x magnification. So I brought this for people to play with if anybody's interested also. Please.
You referenced the Lindbergh case, and I'm not aware of it. Could you give us a little background on that?
So basically, yeah. So basically, the Lindbergh. It was Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator, national hero at a scale where we don't have national heroes anymore, right? Nothing even close. And there was a homemade ladder was left at the scene of a kidnapping from a second floor window, and the baby died, presumably in the commission of the initial kidnapping. They think that maybe they dropped the baby because one of the rails on the ladder split. So they had a broken ladder left leaning against the house, There was, if you want to ever hear about this and you want to invite somebody who's amazing, invite Adam Schrager. Adam Schrager is, he lives in Madison, and he wrote the 16th Rail, the whole book about Lindbergh. He's an amazing speaker. When I'm able to, I get him to come to my forensic botany class and go into gory detail, but super fun because he's a storyteller naturally. He's great. So wooden ladder left at the scene, and that was the only meaningful physical evidence they had for years. And so that ladder came to our laboratory, and our people figured out the wood identification piece, the stuff that I do, was not the interesting part of the Lindbergh kidnapping. The stuff that they did was they looked at like individual machining marks, and they were like, well, that has to be this kind of planer with so many blades, and it has to be getting fed at this kind of rate of speed. And because we know it's processing this species, it can only be coming from the eastern seaboard. So then they start calling and writing letters, and this is in the 30s, right? Calling and writing letters and saying, well, do you have that kind of machine? Yeah, but we haven't run it since 1926. Okay, and on and on and on and on. And then they started going and visiting the mills and looking for individual boards that had the machining patterning characters. That was the amazing part of all that stuff. So it was so involved, really cool on kind of the wood technological side. The botanical stuff was trivial. Yeah.
What did that contribute to the decision?
So what did that contribute? So what they were able to do is they were able to find then the original mill and then find out what neighborhoods they were supplying to in that time frame. And then they started going to those neighborhoods, and they found the banknotes that were paid out, the numbered banknotes that were paid out in ransom money being spent in one of those communities. And then they were able to find out, and then there was some like random thing where somebody saw the guy pay for a tank of gas, and they followed him home. And ultimately, and there's a whole long story we could tell. We could do 3 hours just on parts of the Lindbergh case. But ultimately, they showed that one of the rails was an attic floorboard cut out of their suspect's attic, with the nail holes matching and the growth rings matching and everything. So,
There's a question over there.
Yeah. Alex, you said something at dinner that caught my interest. Could you mention for the rest of the crowd here this drone propeller you've been sent recently?
so yeah, I'm waiting for it. So I'm expecting to get it. So yeah, I was telling people at dinner, I'm a plant anatomist by training. I make microscope slides of plants. Me doing my job is me sitting here like this. There's not, people will say, can I come to your lab and watch you do an ID? It'd be like watching Al Gore dance. Nobody, I mean, like, there's nothing to see. So as a plant anatomist, most of us study, you know, our whole lives some really specific thing. And I was telling people, you get the grass expert. You go to a scientific conference, you're having beers with people, and they're like, well, there was that one time when the real world knocked on my door and needed an answer that only I could give because I'm the expert in grasses, and I was able to, you know, analyze the grass that was stuck underneath the car to show that it was from this park and not from there, and the body dump, and that guy went to jail. I work on wood. Everything everywhere is made out of wood since prehistory. I mean, I've worked on Blackbeard the pirate's ship. Mic drop, sorry, doesn't get cooler than that. What's cooler than a pirate, than the pirate ship? So, I've digressed. So we have the fortune to, because it's wood, and because wood is basically ubiquitous, to be relevant kind of all day, every day, as relevant as a plant anatomist is gonna be. I mean, right, like, this is as day-to-day relevant as plant anatomy ever gets, right here. But, so yeah, I was talking to people, and they have the wooden propeller from a drone that was used to bomb Kyiv. And they want to know, is the propeller Russian wood or Iranian wood? So haven't actually gotten that yet, but we're hoping to get it and do that analysis. So that's, I mean, that's kind of a fundamentally interesting question, right? That has geopolitical, you know, it tells you something about supply chains. It tells you something about what's going on, and who's providing, you know, weapons of war for this. That's fundamentally, I would argue, pretty meaningful. So yeah, we're fortunate to work on things that are still relevant.
Alex, I need to know when you're going to retire.
So this is the funny thing, right? So I was trained by Regis Miller, the immortal, the world-renowned Regis Miller, who retired in January of 2005, and I swear to God, he looks maybe 3 years older than when he retired. And I was the baby. I started working there when I was 18, right? And I remember in 2001, I was taking, no, it had to be earlier than that, it was in the 90s, and I was taking a mycology class, and the mycologist from the Forest Products Lab came over, and he had studied, I think, under Charlie Mims, who was born in the 1800s. And so, he was about to retire, and he said, you know, I got invited to give the history of mycology talk, and I thought, oh my God, I'm the old guy now. But he had trained under somebody born in the 1890s or whatever, so he always thought of himself as the kid. And it's the same sort of thing with me. I'm still working with people who knew me when I was 18. So I sometimes don't realize that I'm just a random middle-aged white guy now, right? And that I'm getting toward like the venerable old man status that like my mentor had. And so basically, I don't have any plans to retire anytime for the foreseeable future. For one, I love what I'm doing, and two, I can't afford to. I've got kids to put through college and stuff. So,
Alex, we were talking earlier about these
I'm sorry.
poaching.
Hold on. Could you restart, please? Because I had two different. Yep.
We were talking earlier about the poaching of trees. What can we do to prevent that?
So, what can we do to prevent poaching of trees? So, I'm going to give you just my personal opinion. So this is not me representing the Forest Service or anything like that, and it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. But I think we have basically two options. One, sniper towers. So we either we put up fences, either we keep people out, right? Whether it's with fences or whatever. Either we get people to leave the forest alone, or we come up with a way for forests to have sustainable monetary value as forests. That's ultimately what it's about. It's ultimately about greed. It's ultimately about those kinds of questions, or not even greed necessarily. It could just be need also, right? And so illegal logging to steal the timber to sell it to make money is one thing. Illegal logging to steal the timber to sell it because you want to convert that land over for some other kind of agriculture is much more common. And so people aren't going, ha ha ha, let's cut down the forest. I mean, some of them are, but more often it's like, well, yeah, and then let's graze cattle, and then let's raise oil palm or something like that, or cocoa, or coca, or, you know, it depends on what your product is. And so, so I guess I am kind of the opinion that either we just got to keep people out of the forest. Like, for example, I have a really good colleague who's originally from Colombia, and FARC, right, the guerrillas in the jungles for years had controlled all that territory in the cocaine trade. And then they signed that, what was it called? The amnesty with FARC, right? I don't know, however many years ago. And a bunch of these rebels came in out of the jungle, and what happened? Illegal logging spiked. Illegal mining spiked, because now people could go into the jungle and not just get shot by drug lords. So the unintended consequence of ending that terrible conflict was now people could get in and go steal stuff again. So it's kind of fun. I mean, it's fun in a horrible way, but I mean, it's fun to study and fun to game out. I'm an academic, so tragedy that isn't personal feels different, right? But that's one of these things where it's a different context.
I think we need to wrap it up. We got to stack chairs and give away some cookies and be on the road.
And thank you
all.
again.